Now, Dawkins, his major argument in his book, The God Delusion, is this. He says, but just wait. You see, if you claim that God created the universe, logically you will have to ask, who created God? You've heard that argument, yes? And then you will have to ask, who created the God that created the God that created the God that created, and so on, back forever, which is not.
Si una criatura creó a Dios, esa criatura también fue creada. Aristóteles en su lógica discutía, debe haber una realidad que causa, pero no es causada, o un ser que se mueve pero no movido. ¿Por qué? Porque si hay una regresión infinita de causas, entonces por definición el proceso entero nunca podría comenzar.
So there is no God. I was staggered when I read that argument. I get it sometimes in schools. I didn't expect to find it from Professor Dawkins. Why not? Well, think about it logically. The question, who created God, has a hidden assumption built into it. Let's abstract from it one level. If I ask, who or what created X? What's the assumption? The assumption is that X was created, obviously. So if you ask who created God, you're assuming God was created. But what if he wasn't, as the Bible claims, that he's eternal? Your question doesn't apply, full stop. It is only a question that is valid for created gods. And you will notice that Dawkins' book is not called The Created Gods Delusion, because that's obvious to everybody that created gods are a delusion. It's interesting, I debated him on these things, and by the way, you can see these debates on my website, johnlennox.org, and I said to him, you think this question is valid? Well, in a sense it is. For instance, I said to him, you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your creator? I've waited 9 years for an answer, but I haven't got it yet. It's a non-question, and yet it's the heart of his argument. I find that quite striking.
All right, your question, where did God come from, assumes that you're thinking of the wrong, obviously it displays that you're thinking of the wrong God, because the God of the Bible is not affected by time, space, or matter. If he's affected by time, space, or matter, he's not God. Time, space, and matter is what we call a continuum. All of them have to come into existence at the same instant, because if there were matter but no space, where would you put it? If there were matter and space but no time, when would you put it? You cannot have time, space, or matter independently. They have to come into existence simultaneously. The Bible answers that in 10 words. In the beginning, there's time. God created the heaven, there's space, and the earth, there's matter. So you have time, space, matter, created a trinity of trinities there. Just, time is past, present, future. Space has length, width, height. Matter has solid, liquid, gas. You have a trinity of trinities created instantaneously, and the God who created them has to be outside of them. If he's limited by time, he's not God. The guy who created this computer is not in the computer. He's not running around in there changing the numbers on the screen, okay? The God who created this universe is outside of the universe. He's above it, beyond it, in it, through it. He's unaffected by it. So the concept that a spiritual force cannot have any effect on a material body, well then I guess you'd have to explain to me things like emotions and love and hatred and envy and jealousy and rationality. I mean, if your brain is just a random collection of chemicals that formed by chance over billions of years, how on earth can you trust your own reasoning processes and the thoughts that you think? Okay, so your question, where did God come from, is assuming a limited God. And that's your problem. The God that I worship is not limited by time, space, or matter. If I could fit the infinite God in my 3-pound brain, he would not be worth worshiping, that's for certain. So that's the God that I worship. Thank you.
On pages 157 to 58 of his book, The God Delusion, Richard Dawkins outlines or summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And when you look at this argument, the conclusion to which is, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, it is a patently logically invalid argument. Even if you grant all 6 steps in the argument, the conclusion that God does not exist doesn't even follow logically from the argument. So it's on its face, it's logically invalid. But when you look at the argument more closely, I think it has a number of premises in it that are false. What are these premises? Well, Dawkins says that you cannot infer a designer of the universe based on the complexity in the universe, because this raises a further question, namely, who designed the designer? And that therefore this leaves biological complexity unexplained. Now, this argument on Dawkins' part, I think, is quite inept, because philosophers of science recognize that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Let me give you an example. Suppose archaeologists digging in the earth were to come across artifacts looking like arrowheads and pottery shards and tomahawk heads. It would obviously be justifiable to infer that these artifacts were the products of some lost tribe of people, even if the archaeologists had no idea whatsoever who these people were or how they came to be there. Similarly, if astronauts were to discover a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that these were the products of intelligent design, even if they had no idea whatsoever where this machinery came from or who put it there. You don't have to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that an explanation is the best. And similarly, in the case of biological complexity, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of biological complexity, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. That can be left an open question for future inquiry. So the argument is inept right from the beginning. In fact, when you think about it, if in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you have to have an explanation of the explanation, that leads immediately to an infinite regress. You need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. You would never have an explanation of anything, which would destroy science. So that Dawkins' principle, if adopted, would actually be completely destructive of science. That's how inept this argument is. So that argument doesn't work. Now, Dawkins goes on to defend the idea that a designer wouldn't be a good explanation because he says the hypothesis of a divine designer is more complex than the world that you're trying to explain. An explanation has to be simpler than the phenomenon you're trying to explain, and he thinks a divine designer is less simple than the world, the universe involving all this complexity. Well, that is completely mistaken. When you reflect on the idea that God is an immaterial entity, a spirit, he is a mind without a body, then God is a remarkably simple entity because he has no parts. There's no composition in God's being. An unembodied mind is an entity that is startlingly simple in its nature. So what Dawkins is obviously confused is a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is a very simple entity. So insofar as you're interested in simplicity, the hypothesis of a divine designer is certainly an advance in simplicity, for what it's worth, over the unexplained, contingent complexity of the universe with all its diversity and variations. So I think that Dawkins' central argument is just hopeless. It is logically invalid on the face of it, and moreover, it's predicated upon premises that I think are clearly false.